then I was told, well, you need to speak to this particular person, which turned out to be the parliamentary researcher concerned. And I was given his mobile number, and the mobile number was dead. And then started looking at his online presence and seeing that he had had no activity for several months, which again seemed strange.
This is the Storytellers, where each week we speak to long-standing journalists at the Times and the Sunday Times and ask them to pick 3 career-defining stories. And I'm really pleased to say that today we can welcome the Sunday Times political editor, Caroline Wheeler. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start with the story that made you. Now, when Theresa May called a snap election in May 2017, in April 2017 even, it was a surprise to many people, apart from you.
Well, it still was a surprise because I had reported that this had been something that had been discussed amongst the kind of echelons of the whip's office about whether or not a snap general election was going to happen about 10 days before she actually called it. And when I wrote the story, it didn't get kind of big sort of licks at the time. It was actually quite a small, what we call a stick on page 1 of the Sunday Express, which was where I was at the political editor at the time. And I was fairly confident of the story because I had seen text messages with members of the whip's office confirming that this had indeed been part of a sort of broad discussion about direction of travel, because if you remember at the time, Theresa May was absolutely stymied in her efforts to getting a Brexit deal through Parliament, and there was lots of discussion at the time of there being only one way out of this, which was to get more MPs in who were Conservative, who were going to back Brexit. I obviously gave this story a bit of welly. We put it on the front page. We didn't splash it. We put it on the stick, and it got a huge amount of attention for a story on the front of the Sunday Express, which is normally relegated to being looked at by the kind of paper reviewers behind the Times and the Telegraph and the others, and it became very much the talking point for the next couple of days. And indeed, the lobby on the Monday morning, there were lots of questions about whether or not there was going to be a snap general election, and they were absolutely killed dead by Number 10 at that time. There was clearly, it was not going to happen. There was not going to be a snap general election. It was not on the cards at all. And then within 10 days, it became true.
Yeah.
And I think at that stage, I mean, there'd been lots of stories in my career that I could have pointed to and said that was pivotal. I'd started my career on a regional newspaper and had won a couple of regional
newspapers. You began in Birmingham,
in Birmingham, that's right. And had won a couple of kind of regional newspaper awards, and had then come to the lobby, and then had been promoted to political editor at the Sunday Express. But that was the first time I think my peers, as it were, kind of sort of looked up and kind of thought, oh, she knows what she's doing.
Yeah, showed you a bit of respect, I suppose.
Yeah, and it sort of also coincided with the fact that at that moment in time, I think I was either in negotiations or was about to start negotiations with the Sunday Times about coming here. And I think that kind of gave me a bit of a kind of feather in my cap, as it were, as I went into those discussions, that a fairly major story that I had written had come true. And as you know, general elections are not something you can generally predict as to when they're going to be called. Everybody has a kind of thought in their head about, the rough timing of it. But this was absolutely a bolt out of the blue, because at the time we had the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So actually that had to be repealed to allow this to happen. So,
she didn't need to go to a general election.
And she didn't
it was a
need
huge
to go
gamble.
to it, and she wasn't running out of time. And I think she had another, 18 months of her tenure to go that she could have served out before having needed to call that general election. So it wasn't one of those kind of intuitive stories. It was actually a story that came about from really good raw intelligence.
When it was refuted in the days after, what's that like for you as a political editor? You state your reputation on the stories you get, and here was a big story for you, making a splash, and it was flatly denied. Do you expect that, or is there a part of you that thinks, what if I've got this wrong?
I think any good journalist always thinks, what have I got this wrong? And I probably do that more than most. And there's many a Saturday where I sit in the Sunday Times newsroom and kind of question myself and make sure that I've really properly kicked the tyres on everything that I'm claiming in the stories, because the integrity of a story is absolutely key. If you do get things wrong and you get things wrong consistently, people stop reading you. They don't believe what you're saying, and when you are making some of those big calls, they don't take them seriously. So making sure that you're being fair and accurate is absolutely essential, particularly, I think, for a political journalist. So yes, having a story refuted is always uncomfortable. And on this occasion, I guess you also sort of price it in. Stories about general elections, there's really only one person, or maybe a handful of people at most, that ever really know what's going through a Prime Minister's mind and through a Prime Minister's head, particularly in terms of calling a poll. They don't tend to talk to many people about it, and in this case, it had been an extremely close-knit circle of people. So it's always quite tricky. But I think there are some stories which you can take more of a gamble on than others. In a general election, you would kind of expect that sort of response. But there's been many other stories which you absolutely know that you've got right, and you know it's correct because you've either spoken to the horse's mouth, or you've spoken to people who are such impeccable sources that you've relied on time and time again, that you know that what you've written is accurate, and it still gets denied. But what tends to happen is that time is a great kind of healer, and often some of the things that we have claimed that have been immediately denied. And I was thinking about this. We wrote a story not very long after the second lockdown had ended, saying that the government was going to phase out free lateral flow testing, and it was absolutely vehemently denied by Number 10 the morning afterwards. But within 48 hours, Michael Gove had softened the government's position, and within, I think, probably 2 to 3 weeks, the story came to be true.
It's that slow stepping away, isn't it? So it's not an outright, they're going to stop, but the government, as you say, soften their position is a good way to put it. Look, it backfired for Theresa May. She lost a majority. She had to form a minority government with the DUP in that instance. When you say that you got the story through intelligence, obviously you're not going to be revealing your sources here, but just describe to me how that intelligence is built up in your career as a political editor. You need to know who to trust. Is it generally a small circle of people, or do you have to cast your net wide?
Well, you tend to have a kind of top tier list of sources, people that you speak to every week. In fact, some people that you speak to almost every day.
And are people willing to talk?
They are, generally speaking. I mean, I think one of the things that I feel has benefited me in my career has been that I started off in the lobby. I've been here now for 20 years. And I started off in the lobby working on a group of regional titles. And what actually happens when you work for kind of regional titles is that the regional press is much more trusted, generally speaking, and that connection between MPs and regional reporters is very close. They often use you as a conduit to speak to their constituents. It's much more of an important relationship for them because it actually links to them being re-elected. So they tend to be much more open about what they're doing. And so I think those kind of 10 years that I spent as a regional reporter enabled me to establish some really strong and close bonds with a number of kind of high-profile MPs that has kind of endured the test of time. Because if you think about it, I mean, I've been in the lobby for 20 years, but I mean, that's almost an average life expectancy for many MPs, perhaps not so much so now, but, you know, lots of MPs have made a career out of being in Parliament. So there's still many MPs around that I started my career with who are still here, like, for example, David Davis, Liam Fox, Peter Hain, although he's in the Lords now, he was very integral to one of the papers I was working on in the Swansea area. So lots and lots of MPs that have been with me through my entire career.
Interesting. Let's move on to the story that nearly broke you. And in September 2023, you revealed that a parliamentary researcher had been arrested, a suspected spy for China. A big story, one of those headlines where if you're looking online, you're going to read the story. Everyone loves espionage, everyone loves reading about it. Big, big story. Why was this the story that nearly broke you then?
Again, I could have chosen many. There's been many stories in my career where you're nearly there all the time and you're on the cusp of a really big story, and whether it be for legal considerations or whether it be that you just can't get beyond that next hurdle, you can't quite land it. And this had very much the kind of hallmarks of that to begin with. It started with a very sort of vanilla tip, if you like, and very vague tip, which had actually come through a colleague, that there had been some kind of infiltration of Parliament by a hostile state, and that was literally all we knew. And I hit many brick walls in terms of trying to work out what was going on. And after a couple of weeks, started to kind of get some more intelligence suggesting that it had been something to do with a parliamentary researcher. It was something to do with China, and that China had been the hostile state. Of course, it could have been Russia, it could have been Iran. There were a number of different hostile states that we could have looked at. And then slowly but surely I was sort of narrowing it down. The suggestion was it had been somebody that had worked for Alicia Cairns was the tip that I'd been given to. She was involved in a police investigation at the time, so was not willing to say anything to me at all about it, and indeed was unable to, had been told expressly not to speak to the press about it for fear that it could impact the investigation. And so actually that made things very difficult, because the circle of people that actually knew about this was probably confined to 4 or 5, I think we worked out in the end, who had actually been told that, and that it eventually included the Prime Minister himself and the Foreign Secretary. But we were just I was banging my head up against a brick wall for a long time, and then...
For how long? For months eventually?
It wasn't months, it was probably, in total, it was probably about 4 weeks from the beginning to the end. But, it was also a question of when you actually decide that you're going to print something, whether you can do it without having the full story, but having enough of a story. And I think myself and the news editor felt very keenly that we couldn't publish until we knew exactly what had happened, and exactly...
Because of the implications of the implications,
and exactly who the individual was that was the subject of interest. And as with many sort of journalistic stories, it eventually came down to a kind of lucky break, sort of speaking to people and saying, can you think of anybody that may have been accused of spying for a hostile state, that may have worked for this individual MP or MPs? And actually, the first tip I was given was actually incorrect. I was given the name of a woman who had worked for Alicia Cairns, and that had come through a sort of circuitous route. But it had been said to me that this was somebody who'd worked quite briefly for her and had disappeared quite quickly, which kind of obviously, starts the kind of the flagging and the alarm bells ringing. But actually, then I was told, well, you need to speak to this particular person, which turned out to be the parliamentary researcher concerned. And I was given his mobile number, and the mobile number was dead. And then started looking at his online presence and seeing that he had had no activity for several months, which again seemed strange. He'd recently been appointed to a different organisation to serve on their board. They were telling me that he'd disappeared off the face of the planet. And at that stage, you start thinking, there's something up here.
Why?
But again, from actually getting to that stage of having who we thought it was, to actually getting enough confirmation to be confident that we could write a story. And of course, the Sunday Times didn't actually name the individual concerned at the time. Our sister paper did subsequently name. We chose not to, but obviously we were able to provide enough information within the copy of the story that if you were in the know, so to speak, if you were working in that world, it wasn't too difficult to piece together who it was. But for the wider public, it would have been more difficult for them to do it. So we felt, from a kind of legal perspective in terms of privacy, that we had met our legal obligations on that front. The Times took a different position on it.
Now, I was going to ask you about this. So the next day, the parliamentary researcher was named as Chris Cash. That was a story that ran in the Times as a result of your story in the Sunday Times. What are your thoughts about that? Was there a tussle there about whether you name that person? Was there a thought by you that, oh, actually, fair enough, it's another day, we've got more information, so it's okay to name him? Or actually, this isn't my paper, and I probably wouldn't have done that. Was there a tussle between the teams, really, about whether you name this person or not?
Well, each of the newspapers have different editors, and each editor will take a different legal decision and legal judgment whilst consulting with the News Corps lawyers, basically. I think in our case, we had been operating under the auspices that we weren't going to name, that we thought that that was going to be quite difficult for us to do. And bear in mind, I think, whilst we had the name, I think it was on Thursday morning, it may have been Thursday afternoon, it was actually not until Saturday lunchtime, that we had got the confirmation that we needed to feel that we were in a confident enough position to run the story. And indeed, we didn't get the Metropolitan Police statement, which confirmed that this individual had been arrested alongside another co-conspirator until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So actually, there wasn't a huge amount of time to consider the kind of full legal context of what we were doing before publication. And I think the decision at that point was taken that we perhaps hadn't done enough to justify a public interest defence to name him, which meant that the Times had longer over the course of the next day to do that. And actually, you do need to go to quite long lengths to do that, to provide a memo to the lawyers, to give them the justification. And we had...
Did they outscoop you? I mean, it was your story. It took you 4 weeks. It's the story that nearly broke you. So we know how frustrating it was. Yet they land the name. Is that annoying? Do you
know, I didn't think of it in that way at the time. I mean, I was sort of involved in conversations on the Sunday about what the Times were going to do, and they wanted to understand why we had taken the decision that we had taken. So I sort of actually look at it the other way around. It's almost a badge of honour, I think, when somebody takes on your story. And actually that story ran for, I think, 3 or 4 days. In fact, even into the following weekend, I think we had the follow-up, which basically showed that Tom Tugendhat, the security minister, had some contact with him subsequent to having taken up that very contentious post within the Home Office. So no, I didn't feel too bad about it. I was quite happy that they had seen and recognised that it was a big story and had decided to take it on.
Been able to take it.
And also what had helped them, if I think about it now, was that there had been MPs coming out and saying that they thought that the individual should be named, that they were considering using parliamentary privilege to do it, and that it was appropriate to do so because actually people within Parliament needed to know how exposed they had been potentially to this threat, to this potential hostile state actor acting within their environment. So, and that was the justification that was used in their public interest defence, something that we hadn't had the benefit of sort of 24 hours before.
He denied Chris Cash, at the time, everything, every one of the allegations. I've not found any reporting about him since or what's happened. He was arrested, obviously, on suspicion of spying for China. What then happens to that story? Has he just disappeared off the face of the earth? Do you then have to follow it up? What sort of happens now, 3 or 4 months later?
So we keep an eye on it, basically. He's had his bail extended, as far as I understand. Dipesh Gadkar, who worked alongside me on the story, our Home Affairs editor, keeps in touch with the spooks and with the Metropolitan Police operation to make sure that we don't miss any significant moments on that. I mean, there are other implications of it, which kind of aside from just what happens to him next, it's also about the position of the government. If you remember, the big story that kind of came off the back again, the day 3 into this was how the UK government was going to respond to China, and if we were going to basically categorise them as a hostile state in terms of our dealings with them. And there still is a big schism within the Conservative Party about how China should be viewed, with people feeling, in some senses, that the UK government is not being hawkish enough about it. And I mean, the fun thing about the story, the bit that was great fun, was that we broke it the weekend of the G7 summit. And actually the Prime Minister had a conversation with the Chinese Premier on the margins of that summit about the story to effectively make it clear our displeasure that this had potentially taken place on British soil. So, you know, there are...
That's a bit of kudos there.
So those stories, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, they're kind of sensationalist in that, you know, the idea of a British individual spying on behalf of a hostile state and gaining access to one of the most sensitive buildings in the UK and potentially gaining access to sensitive material is obviously in and of itself an exciting story. But actually, for me, it's sometimes the bigger implications, the kind of geopolitical implications of that, which are more interesting, but also probably more sort of long, you know, have more long-running and more long-standing implications.
Let's talk about the story that stays with you, and this is something that you've been reporting on for years. You've written a book about it, the contaminated blood scandal, and this, for context, is the up to 30,000 people who were given contaminated blood products in the 70s and 80s here in the UK, leading to the deaths of more than 3,000 people after they contracted HIV, hepatitis C. You've really championed this story, and this has turned into a, you know, personal campaign for you as well, alongside others like Dame Diana Johnson, who you've been working with on it. Tell me how you first came into contact with the story. Where did it all start?
So it was the first story that I wrote as a journalist. Started it as a rookie reporter on the Sunday Mercury newspaper, which was a sort of News of the World style red top that was covering the West Midlands region. And I had been fortunate enough to be given a traineeship at the Birmingham Post and Mail, which was owned by Trinity Mirror at the time. And you had to do a kind of secondment on each of the titles, so to work on a Sunday, to work on an evening title, to work on a morning title. And I started my career off on the Sunday. And one of the first ever ring-ins that came into the news desk was a chap called Mick Mason, who told me this absolutely horrific story about how he had HIV and hepatitis C, and now believed that he'd been infected with variant CJD, which in old money was mad cow disease, because he had been receiving factor 8 treatment for his haemophilia. And that was that's a common story of many of the victims of this particular scandal. And I kind of remember thinking at the time that I was being kind of set up by my news desk, who were trying to test whether I knew what a story was, because it was such an impossibly, extraordinary story that I couldn't actually believe it was true. And I thought that Mick must be some kind of mad conspiracy theorist. But actually every word of what he told me in that telephone conversation turned out to be true. And I just think it ignited something within me about just how utterly abhorrent this was. I mean, the idea that, you know, this was something that had been given to these individuals by the state. It had been given to them after they had been receiving treatment that was supposed to enhance their lives, given that factor 8 had been seen to be a cutting-edge treatment for all kinds of bleeding disorders. And also used in sort of mainstay practice as well. You know, if you gave birth, as Anita Roddick did, and she was given hepatitis C, or if you were unfortunate enough to end up in a car accident and there wasn't enough blood product to give you at the time, you would be given this. And it ended in this appalling tragedy with, you know, hundreds of thousands of people eventually affected, and suffering really life-limiting illnesses. And no justice had ever been delivered. And by the time I came upon this story, it had been going on for 30 years. And indeed, the Sunday Times, as it did with the thalidomide scandal, had been at the forefront of championing this particular injustice. So it kind of feels kind of like we've come full circle, really. That
Were they
I've kind of ended up there.
championing it before you arrived? Was this
Yeah.
something right? Okay,
No,
great.
I mean, it was one
so
of
this
those.
was perfect alignment, really.
Yeah, it was one of these stories where, you know, everybody kind of made a big song and dance about it in the kind of mid-80s, when it was really emerging for the first time that haemophiliacs had been infected through the use of factor VIII, which was largely coming in through blood products from America, which had been procured often from people on Skid Row who were more likely to be drug users, more likely to be alcoholics, and they were paid for their blood. So there was something which was called the Ooze for Booze program, where people effectively would turn up half cut and would give money, would be given $7 or $8 for their blood, and introduced into the blood supply you know, these really virulent diseases, so it had some attention, but actually, as with lots of things, if they're not immediately answered, they kind of go away, and the injustice just drags on and on and on and on and on. And I mean, you know, the scandal that people kind of draw comparisons to is now the Horizon post office scandal, which the drama is being screened on ITV at the moment. But actually, in comparison to that, I mean, that dragged on for a decade or more. This has been dragging on for 5 decades.
Yeah.
And in that particular scandal, they have now been offered compensation. In this scandal, they still have not.
They still haven't. And that is a fight that you continue to make, I know. And look, it was the subject of a parliamentary vote before Christmas. You were really instrumental in trying to get the public inquiry done as well a few years ago, which is still ongoing, I believe, as well. For you, as a journalist, it's often a tussle, I know, when you are asked to give your opinion, or you put some of you into a story personally. Why did you feel comfortable doing it in this case? I've heard you say you are not an opinion writer, you're not a political commentator. For you, your role is to kind of sit on both sides of the fence, I suppose, and you generally will not be, passing your own personal comment on big political stories. Why was this the story that you felt you could kind of slip out of the impartiality and present yourself as a key campaigning voice on it?
I think when you have spoken to as many victims as I have spoken to, and sadly some of those that have shared their stories with me are not here any longer, and in fact 3 instrumental campaigners died last year during the course of having submitted the manuscript for the book and it being published. And you listen and you really interrogate the story, which I feel that I did, and having sort of looked at both sides of it, having spoken to the politicians that were involved in this scandal and were looking at what happened, and also speaking to those that had been infected by it. There was just no question or doubt in my mind that this was an absolute travesty on a huge scale, and that there is no justification, and whether or not you believe that there is culpability, whether it's the state, whether it's individual politicians, whether it's individual doctors, there is no excuse in my mind that these people have had their lives destroyed in untold ways. I mean, not just, died in absolutely horrific, and I mean really horrific circumstances. But even those that are still alive today, I know orphans who have lost both parents to HIV, that lost them before their 10th birthday. I know parents who lost children, Colin and Jan Smith, who I often talk about, who I think are absolute heroes in this campaign, lost their 8-year-old son Colin. There is no amount of money in my mind as a mum of 3 that would ever compensate me for the loss of a child. Other campaigners that were put into care, that had one parent who died, or another parent who had a mental breakdown because they couldn't cope with what was going on to them, and often the poverty that surrounded these individuals, people that were not able to work for huge swathes of their professional lives because it had been completely blighted by illness. That the stories are so appalling that I can see no reason why they should not receive some form of compensation,
Yeah.
and answers as well as to why this happened to them, and whether or not, and the government has really stood firm on not doing that because they didn't want to accept blame. And I think that's completely wrong. I think whether they were at fault or not, and in my view there was some fault on the part of the government, but whether you accept that or not, that doesn't in any way exonerate the state from actually trying to do something to ameliorate the suffering that these people have endured.
Let's finish on being a female political editor. There are thankfully more of you around these days. And I think it's a really predictable question for me to say, what's it like being a woman working in politics? It's tough, I'm sure it is. It's tough for everyone. But I wonder, as you've worked through the decades, whether it is a better place now for women, and also whether you naturally have to make maybe more personal sacrifices, being a mum, being, a romantic partner, a wife, and everything else that's involved, an often load that is unfairly more on the woman than on the man, typically. I wonder how you've juggled that.
It's had a massive impact in lots of different ways. Joining was a shock 20 years ago. I was at the time, I believe, I was the youngest lobby correspondent. I joined when I was 25. It was very much the preserve of older men, usually white and male men generally. So I was one of a small cohort of women in the lobby at the time, and I remember that we'd only just recently got a kind of female toilet on the lobby corridor because they just hadn't needed one because there hadn't been that many of us there at the time. So it was a bit of a shock, and I'd gone from working in Birmingham doing door knocks and writing about school fates and things like that.
Also having a patch.
Yeah, and having a patch and all of those things, to suddenly being thrust into the kind of seat of power. And actually it is a village, and you do bump into people, and you can quite often bump into a cabinet minister walking across Portcullis House, for example. But it did feel a little bit like a kind of a boys' club, a gentleman's club. And I was sort of slightly shielded from it a little bit because I was in the regional lobby at the time, and there were more women in the regional lobby, I think, at that time than sort of proportionately to the national lobby, because we were drawn from the regions, so we weren't coming from national newspapers, which I think meant that there was a kind of a fresher turnover of both women, but also people with regional accents and not publicly educated. It was the regional lobby that was kind of filling and diversifying the lobby in ways that perhaps the national lobby wasn't doing. It was one of the reasons, the fact that we had so few female voices for a large period of time while I was there, that we set up the women's lobby, which myself and Laura Koonsberg, who's left the lobby subsequently, were chair of together for nearly a decade, and I now hold that role on my own. And we have
ball
events,
to juggle.
Yeah, and we have events quite frequently in Parliament where the female journalists come together and they mix and mingle with senior politicians, and we did that very deliberately because, particularly towards the end of the New Labour, it's interesting, it was New Labour actually, the New Labour era, there was a real sort of period of time where there was a lot of business being done with our male colleagues on the golf courses or in the bars during the evening. And I waited a long time to have children, partly because I was terrified of going off for maternity leave and losing my kind of foothold in the lobby, because it had been such a kind of long-standing dream and ambition to get there. But actually, once myself and other female colleagues started having families, we needed a way of kind of evening up the sort of the unfairness of us not being able to be in the bars every night, because we had to go home, put children to bed and read to them and all sorts of things. But there's all kinds of ways it affects you as a woman, and one of the conversations I will never forget, and he will know who I'm talking about, but at one particular instant I was being wooed by the Daily Mail to leave the Sunday Times to go to the Daily Mail as a senior, in a very senior role. And I remember said individual saying to me, what can I do to persuade you to come and work for us at the Daily Mail? You know, do you want more money? You know, do you want a better title? What is it that you want? And I just said, well, how many bedtimes do you think I can do working on a daily title compared to the Sunday Times, for example? Because at the moment, I reckon I can get away with doing between 3 and 4 bedtimes a week, which is actually really important to me. You know, at the time my children were learning to read, and actually that moment lying in bed kind of, you know, doing the kind of phonics with them was really important.
I was usually falling asleep at that point towards the end of it anyway.
And the person offering me the job was absolutely flabbergasted and just said, I've never been asked that question before. And so, you know, I think that there are different, you know, there are different things that at play, particularly when you're a mum and a partner, and actually
I sort of hate to kind of point out differences between the sexes, but actually it is really important to respect the differences and what dads might want to do and what mums might want to do, and sort of how that transpires within the workplace. There's no point banging on about equality if you can't, you know, both be able to kind of carve out various bits of your day or have enough of a work-life balance to kind of make it work.
And also I just wouldn't be happy. I wouldn't be happy in my work if I didn't know that I was giving enough of myself to my family. And I think the Sunday Times has been, and actually working in Sunday newspapers generally, has been a really good fit for motherhood and for family life, because although we lose our weekends, which is not great, in that, you know, the responsibility for looking after the kid falls on my partner, it always meant that I had Mondays with them, which actually meant they had mum or dad. As I used to justify it to myself, they'd have us, you know, 6 days of the week as opposed to just 5. So it kind of worked for us sort of better. But yeah, really, really tricky to balance all of that. And I think a lot of the women in the lobby would feel the same. And sadly, we do lose really good women sometimes when they do embark on that family life, because actually the hours that Parliament sits are incredibly unfamily friendly.
It still doesn't mix.
Yeah.
Still work to be done. But look, thank you so much for speaking
Pleasure.
to us. It's been absolutely fascinating. Caroline Wheeler, political editor of the Sunday Times. Thank you.
Thank you.